The veteran who owns the car told us she has no idea who Mike is.
Mike. I don't know who you are. I don't know where you are. But you're man.
Right? Like the USAID is a terrorist organization. We had a video, a stream the other day where I talked about how USAID is literally working with special forces to try to find whatever a Chinese project is being done in Africa so they can destroy it, so they could disrupt it. And I do consider it part of my mandate as an American leftist to defend China from the unbelievable bullshit that's being spread about them constantly. And the reason why I say that is not because I think of China as the ideal socialist society. It's not. You can't disagree with the tremendous progress that is being made in China. There's no debating that. But there's also no debating that they have a long ways to go. And I see encouraging things that are happening. I'm in Saskatchewan, and our premier is more focused on Chinese tariffs and not American tariffs. Like, it's insane. And the right-wing farmers here are so brain broken that they eat up the propaganda against the Chinese, but are like foaming about becoming the 51st state. And I'm like, how do you not see it's the same picture? The Chinese tariffs against, I mean, like Canada, you have to understand something about Canada. Canada is the 51st state. That's why this hurts so much. Like, that's why it hurts so much. You guys are the 51st state. Yeah, China forgives 23 loans for 17 African countries, expands win-win trade and infrastructure project. I mean, yeah. But again, China is trading with these countries. That means that China is evil. Like, that's literally just the way people approach this kind of stuff. Oh, wow, what a surprise. Right on the day the US and the USA resume utter genocide bombings, the CIA start posting about China not helping Palestinians enough. Yeah, I know. The United States, it's a way of redirecting your own blame. We can't even stop our own government from doing a genocide. So instead of taking the blame on ourselves and feeling the tremendous shame that we deserve to feel because we failed to stop it, and I know a lot of other people have, and I'm not saying that people haven't sacrificed more than me. They have. A lot of people are suffering right now for all they did to fight for Palestine. But we as a movement are not strong enough to stop it. So we've got to blame China. Even though China has absolutely nothing to do with Israel except for the tiniest amount of like trade, commercial trade. China wants a larger consumer base so it lifts nations up. China wants subjects so it destroys and weakens. Both are selfish, but China is pragmatically better for the world. How the hell is China developing Africa bad for Africa? Unless you are some sort of chauvinist racist. What, you think that you think the gold that's in the, these countries is going to be left there? Or is it going to be the status quo, which is stolen by the West? If you want Africa to develop, it has to develop its economy so that it has economic clout. Saudi Arabia was basically a backward country until the United States developed its oil industry. And now it's one of the most clouded countries in the world. Why? Because they developed their economy. Now, personally, I think the Saudi Arabian model sucks ass. But that's what happens. That's the best case scenario for a U.S. ally. And the thing about China is, I don't expect China to be like angels. I'm not a dumbass. I'm not orientalizing China. I expect China to act in its rational best interest. But I also see and watch and see what they say and what they do. And the evidence points to China being much more beneficial for the world, especially for Africa and Latin America, than what the United States and the West is. And so that's the game. This is the reality. Either you are a running dog and supporter of Western imperialism, or you're somebody who believes in a multipolar world and you're trying to build international institutions. That's what I'm behind. And I will never, ever, ever, ever participate in, oh, I'm going to help the West attack China. Like, what the fuck are you doing? That's why we need to go into why USAID is a terrorist organization. I feel like a lot of people think of USAID as like handing out medicine to poor, starving Africans who are dying of AIDS. And that's what USAID is. USAID is just how generous and pragmatic and nice America is. No, USAID is a terrorist organization, and the more it's dismantled, the better.
Development, or USAID for short, can't be a bad thing, right? Well, as is usual with well-intentioned American institutions, there's another less savory side.
Those are poppy flowers.
The presence of the United States is, as a leading power in the free world, is involved in your work directly. The people who are opposed to aid should realize that this is a very powerful source of strength for us. It permits us to exert influence for the maintenance of freedom. If we did not, were not so heavily involved, our voice would not speak with such vigor. And as we do not want to send American troops to a great many areas where freedom may be under attack, we send you.
USAID, established in 1961 under President John F. Kennedy, was framed as a humanitarian organization aimed at promoting social and economic development in the Global South. In reality, it was just another piece of a larger Cold War strategy. The Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 centralized foreign aid under USAID, and explicitly meant to oppose Soviet influence through economic diplomacy. This soft power approach was in reality a cover for humanitarian programs to serve as tools to advance US geopolitical interests. As Lyndon B. Johnson later admitted, food aid was meant to redirect recipient spending for military equipment or security purposes. A perfect example of this is Johnson's Food for Peace program, which was meant to discourage countries from accepting any help from the USSR rather than focus on helping the hungry or starving. Necessary famine aid for India wasn't provided until India agreed to stop criticizing the US war on Vietnam. While USAID claimed to support self-reliance, its official reasoning prioritized counteracting drivers of violence and expanding democracy and free markets, badly masked foreign language objectives that ultimately serve American capital interests. Post 9/11, USAID saw a budget surge, a 70% increase from 2001 to 2003, which tied the development to US military objectives, meaning national security, which just goes to show how little good USAID aimed to do in the first place. After the illegal and undemocratic dissolution of the USSR, USAID shifted its focus to sustainable development, meaning tailoring aid to neoliberal reforms. It targeted post-Soviet states to establish functioning democracies, but only if that democracy functions in US economic interests. This is something I've covered in my Poland and Romania videos here. By the 2000s, the agency funded attempts to rebuild the governments the US destroyed in Afghanistan and Iraq, while framing its loose and ineffectual poverty reduction programs as addressing the root causes of instability, rather than, the illegal American invasions. The Trump regime has, as of this video, practically abolished USAID, justifying it as a major cost-cutting measure. This has accidentally also meant freezing American programs critical to countering China's Belt and Road Initiative, for example, amongst other covert American actions. Let's take a look at some, shall we? Back to the video in just a second. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Fume. Have you ever caught yourself reaching for a bad habit?
A similar effort that is being made by the president.
I understand that USAID is a form of soft power, but isn't some of the work good? Like they don't give out food and medicine. Okay, let me throw it to you in the other way. Let's say that Russia had an organization called Russia Aid, right? And Russia Aid came into our country, and they spent a few $100 million helping people in rural Appalachia get some housing assistance, and it helped a couple 100,000 Appalachians in America get slightly better conditions. But 80% of the people in Russia Aid were spies, and they were sending hundreds of millions of dollars to, say, for example, Project Veritas. And they were sending hundreds of millions of dollars to various, the Proud Boys. And they were sending hundreds of millions of dollars to supporting various far-right groups in this country with the goal of overthrowing the government in favor of an even more right-wing government. doesn't hit as hard because we elected Trump already. But you get my point. Wouldn't you be like, yeah, probably we don't want Russia aid. Yeah, they're doing some nice things in Appalachia. But overall, I think the fact that they're pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into, or hundreds of millions of dollars into like politically fascist groups in order to attack our government is probably a bad thing, right? I mean, how much did people bellyache and bawl their eyes out over a couple $100,000 of Facebook ads? Imagine if they were in this country with dozens of spies supporting all the most right-wing lunatics. What if Russia aid was actually giving them weapons and was working with Russian intelligence to funnel weapons to these groups and they started killing people? That's what USAID does.
In 1973, Senator Ted Kennedy wrote to the CIA asking if USAID was involved in Southeast Asian operations.
And that's why
Secretary of State
actions linked to USAID. We're going to explain it right now.
At the time, Henry Kissinger confirmed that this was indeed the case, which led former CIA officer John Kiriko to call USAID a propaganda adjunct of the CIA. By 1970, the genocide of the Mayan population in Guatemala was well underway following a series of counterinsurgency actions carried out by a series of US-backed military dictatorships in the country. The police force of Guatemala specifically needed, quote-unquote, counterinsurgency training. Here, USAID stepped in to train, organize, and pay for at least 30,000 police officers. This form of training is best seen in another example.
So the United States of America trained 30,000 genocidal Gestapo agents. This is USAID. If this doesn't stop you from talking about USAID ever again, I don't know, like, are you listening? Are you processing what I'm saying? Like, are you processing what 30,000 genocidal Gestapo agents means? Do you get it?
In Uruguay, around the same time, USAID's Dan Mitrione specialized in teaching police officers the best way to torture people, using, and I quote, electrical shocks to sensitive areas of the body, using drugs to induce vomiting, and other psychological torture techniques. Demonstrations of these methods were carried out on live subjects, where Mitrione's agents kidnapped beggars from the street and subsequently tortured them to death. He would eventually be captured by guerrillas and rightfully executed. The Nixon administration stated at his death that his devoted service to the cause of peaceful progress in an orderly world will remain as an example for free men everywhere. What an example. Continuing in Latin America, in the 1980s, USAID was managing non-lethal aid to the Contras after Congress tried to distance the program from the CIA following the Iran-Contra scandal. By 1988, USAID was feeding and clothing 30,000 Contra fighters and their families. Despite claims of humanitarian intent, USAID's role was simple: to maintain the Contras' state of readiness. A well-supplied, combat-ready army can be used as leverage in peace negotiations, which had the opposite effect. It prolonged the conflict.
Can you imagine, like, if this was like... I'm trying to imagine the opposite. I'm trying to imagine, like, China has 40,000 Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, guerrillas in Saskatchewan, and China Aid is providing them food and resources so they could survive. Like, what the fuck are we talking about here?
Unsurprisingly, indigenous Americans were frequently politically active across Latin America as a result of centuries of oppression. Between 1996 and 2000, Peruvian dictator Alberto Fujimori ordered the forced sterilization of 300,000 mostly indigenous women, and USAID gave him $35 million to do it. No American official has ever faced any legal consequences for this horrific act. Between 1984 and 1994, USAID granted $51 million to the University of Nebraska's Afghanistan Studies Center to produce textbooks for Afghani children. These texts weaponized education, embedding anti-communist propaganda into basic arithmetic even. One group of mujahideen attacks 50 Russian soldiers. In the attack, 20 Russians were killed. How many Russians fled? Religiously flavored propaganda was also explicit. D is for deen, meaning religion. Our religion is Islam. The Russians are the enemies of the religion of Islam. If that's true, then so are the Americans, but I digress. USAID's Islamabad office funneled even more of this innocent, non-lethal aid to Afghani mujahideen in Pakistan, including funds diverted to purchase weapons. A portion of these weapons ended up arming Pakistani radicals opposing Muhammad Zia al-Haq, while USAID money also financed luxury vehicles for mujahideen commanders. USAID prioritized destabilizing Soviet influence over actually helping anyone and helped create the highly unstable situation we currently have in the country. Of course, that's not to say Socialist Afghanistan or the Soviets made no mistakes, but we made a dedicated deprogram episode about that here. In Venezuela, US sanctions beginning in 2017 crippled Venezuela's oil economy, causing hyperinflation, food insecurity for millions, and a migrant crisis. These sanctions precipitated healthcare collapse and widening poverty, while blocking Red Cross aid imports. At the same time, leaked US embassy documents exposed USAID's funneling of $116 million to Carlos Vecchio, a fugitive opposition figure appointed as an ambassador under Juan Guaido's sham US-backed interim government. These funds, supposedly for developmental assistance, were instead diverted to opposition-aligned NGOs and politicians abroad, many living in luxury while ordinary Venezuelans face shortages as a result of US-imposed economic sanctions. Recently, FBI investigations revealed Guaido and his allies had embezzled over $1 billion in US aid, meaning only 2% of the aid was used for humanitarian purposes. This, of course, is by design. The US government isn't stupid. This corruption is part of how USAID's democracy promotion entrenches dependency on foreign-funded networks that prioritize regime change. It ensures that these opposition figures never bite the hand that feeds. Add to this the fact that regional media was nearly 90% dependent on USAID grants, and you have quite the cocktail. This became a problem recently because, with the Trump regime freezing USAID's global operations, many civil societies and democracy promotion groups and independent media outlets started closing up shop, magically, almost as if they were bankrolled by the US government to push regime change. Oh my. Well, they were, and I've made another dedicated video on that here. But let's take a closer look at the so-called independent media. USAID has been spending over $250 million per year training a network of more than 6,200 reporters working for almost 1,000 outlets or organizations, this time under the guise of promoting independent media. The shutdown of USAID shows just how much pro-US content out there is astroturfed by this supposedly aid-based organization, and exposes just how much major parts of the global media are nothing but an adjunct to US propaganda and foreign policy interests. Interesting to note, not one single outlet with a radical leftist perspective has received so much as a cent from USAID.
Isn't that odd? Wow, man. Well, that's actually not totally true. I mean, if you're an ultra or an anarchist, there's been plenty of CIA support for those groups. As the CIA says, if you want to make sure that a movement has absolutely no motion and is no threat to the United States of America, make sure you support your anarchists and your ultras.
Much for the independent part of independent media. Echoing this point was the CEO of USAID-supported organizations in Bosnia, who said, bluntly, if you're funded by the US government, there are certain topics that you would simply not go after because the US government has its interests that are above all others. In Ukraine, following the 2014 Euromaidan protests, the US allocated $44 billion in foreign assistance to Ukraine through USAID, Treasury, and USDA, explicitly targeting vague democratic transition work. These grants would bankroll political work that would eventually lead to the freezing of elections and the banning of all opposition parties, including the several highly popular communist parties within Ukraine. The Trump regime's 2025 freeze on USAID projects abruptly stopped some of this work that had continued into the war, with journalists writing for the Kiev Independent noting that regional media, which is 90% reliant on US grants, faces total collapse. In Syria, it was USAID's stabilization programs that advanced US geopolitical aims under the guise of humanitarian effort. Its objectives explicitly targeted regime change, focusing on demilitarizing Syria, reorienting its government towards a pro-US foreign policy, and ensuring it does.
Holy shit, this is based. Journalists at Voice of America were just informed they've been put on administrative leave. 2 people there told me this went to all full-time employees. Voice of America is effectively shut down from this moment. This is one of those things where it's really, really Jada Pondon. This is where it's really hard to analyze because on the one, this is incredible. It's incredible because this is the type of stuff that is America's strength in the world. This is what makes American power so hard to counter because there's just so much pablum that's out there that flows to the top of Google whenever you talk about any subject. Destroying Voice of America is really bad for America as far as a global hegemon. And so it's like What explains this? How can we analyze this and understand it? Why does Donald Trump and the people in his administration, why do they believe that shutting down Voice of America is actually going to make America stronger? And I come back with a response that is, honest to God, I'm really concerned, actually. I think I consider this to be something that is good in the long term, but bodes very poorly in the short term, because it means that they're so profoundly incompetent and stupid that they're believing their own bullshit. It's like one thing for you to, use QAnon to get your message out, to get supporters of like kind of cranks and weirdos online, right? That's one thing. But actually believing QAnon, that's quite another. And this is basically, Donald Trump is like a QAnon believer. He's a like shock doc. He's doing shock doctrine on American institutions. And like, if you study history, there's one thing that will continually start to pop up more and more and more over the course of your study of history, which is that the more effective and centralized a polity is, the stronger it is. This continually pops up over and over. What made the absolutist monarchies more powerful than the more, decentralized feudal monarchies of the early Middle Ages? Well, because it was more centralized, they could command more resources. They could command larger armies. They could effectively wage war better.
Doesn't threaten Israel. Investigative reporting reveals deeper ties. USAID contracted Creative Associates International for projects like Zun Zunio, a Cuban Twitter clone designed to foment dissent, under the same civil society support program used to destabilize Syria, Libya, and Egypt. CAI's parent company, Creative Associates International Inc., they're not very creative, operated as a CIA front in Pakistan.
So the JFK papers were released the other day, and I'm waiting for somebody to do a good sit down on it before I talk about it. But one thing I did see is that there were 1,800 companies that were CIA fronts, or at least willing to offer themselves as CIA fronts. 1,800 companies. That's crazy.
Collaborating with Blackwater mercenaries to conduct cross-border raids into Afghanistan. It's all interconnected. In other attempts, USAID framed its covert regime change efforts in Cuba under the guise of public health. Documents and operatives reveal that USAID explicitly viewed HIV prevention workshops as a perfect excuse to mask anti-government activities, attempting to leverage medical outreach to infiltrate Cuban society.
USA used HIV prevention workshops in Cuba as a front to foment dissent. USAID considered HIV prevention workshops the perfect excuse for covert anti-government activities, AP found. And people are like, man, I can't believe you don't like USAID. That's insane. That is evil. That's enemy of humanity shit. And the reason is because I want to prevent the spread of disease. But we shouldn't use, medical provision to do fucking CIA shit and discredit it in the minds of billions of people around the world. That's fucking evil.
In society. Young Latin American recruits with no undercover experience or training, paid as little as $5 an hour, pose as tourists to target universities, using workshops to train activists in organizing tactics, while gathering intelligence. Despite USAID's public defense that the program enabled support for Cuban civil society while addressing HIV education, internal communications exposed its primary focus: recruiting people to destabilize the Cuban government. The obvious ethical violations drew sharp condemnation from around the world. Interaction, a coalition of global NGOs, condemned the exploitation of health initiatives for intelligence operations, stating, "The US government should never sacrifice delivering basic health services to advance an intelligence goal." Even USAID's own contractors admitted the HIV workshops were strategically designed as a perfect excuse to evade Cuban scrutiny. Senator Patrick Leahy, overseeing USAID funding, criticized the agency for prioritizing contractor profits over its humanitarian mission, noting it tarnishes USAID's long track record as a leader in global health. The State Department, however, doubled down, with White House spokesperson and eventual MSNBC host Jen Psaki asserting such programs as promoting democracy worldwide, basically saying the quiet bit out loud that American-funded civil societies are used by the CIA for government destabilization purposes. Of course, not all of them, but when you don't know which is which, it's better to be on the safer side and assume that it's being used for American foreign policy interests. As in Venezuela and Ukraine, USAID's shutdown had shaken a Miami-based anti-Cuban government outlet called CubaNet. It turned to its readers for funding in a desperate plea stating, "We are facing an unexpected challenge, the suspension of key funding that sustains part of our work." That key funding was coming from USAID. Cuba's long-standing and extremely well-evidenced accusations of US-backed destabilization gained even further credibility as the scandal unfolded. The Cuban government has repeatedly warned that foreign civil society programs served as fronts for destabilization. The US scheme risked irreparably damaging global trust in public health initiatives, with HIV prevention now potentially seen as a dangerous front for seditious activity, much like fake vaccination programs conducted by the US in Pakistan when searching for Osama bin Laden. The fallout extended to diplomatic relations as well. A declassified State Department review condemned the US response to the ensuing crisis as plagued by a lack of senior leadership, ineffective communications, and systemic disorganization, basically incompetence at all levels. In 2017, the CIA abruptly withdrew from Havana, with its tail between its legs. While liberal pundits have been singing USAID's praises and touting its so-called accomplishments, the international reception has been interesting, with many finding common ground in welcoming the retreat of USAID funding. El Salvador's President Nayib Bukele, himself a bit too close for comfort to American foreign policy, said, "Most governments don't want USAID funds flowing into their countries because they understand where much of that money actually ends up. At best, maybe 10% of the money reaches real projects that help people in need. There are such cases. But the rest is used to fuel dissent, finance protests, and undermine administrations that refuse to align with the globalist agenda." I hate populist speak, but you get his point. Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro, stated, "While the press may be lamenting the demise of USAID-backed media, many heads of states are not. Take your money with you. It's poison." Since tools of empire often come home to bite the empire's citizens, the so-called imperial boomerang, referred to JT's great video here for more, it shouldn't be a surprise that the US Department of Defense employs a minimum of 60,000 people whose only job is to influence public opinion from behind a keyboard. Basically, the largest undercover troll army in the world, who are very likely breaking domestic and international law. The so-called Twitter files revealed a real campaign by the Department of Defense and Twitter to carry out an influence operation across the Middle East. Another aspect of this deep control, or at least heavy influence, of social media by the government was revealed by a Mint Press investigation that found that apps like Facebook, Twitter, Google, Reddit, and even TikTok are filled with former CIA and USAID officials, amongst others from other national security agencies. And yet, according to an internal document, USAID is frustrated by those same sites, plus Twitch and 4chan and Discord, because users are able to build communities that lead them to populist rhetoric and the challenging of US government narratives. The document goes on to outline methods of suppressing actually existing independent media, such as threatening advertisers into cutting ties with websites to strangle their finances. Later, USAID suggests directing people to mainstream, corporate-owned outlets to psychologically inoculate themselves against inconvenient facts that challenge US hegemony. This so-called pre-bunking, which includes discrediting the brand, the credibility, and reputation of those making supposed false allegations, is just a euphemism for a policy of the state censoring or trying to censor media it can't control, and those are America's imperialist objectives. They're designed to counter foreign so-called enemies with varying degrees of success. Crucial for the system are people and programs who assist in diverting aid funds to corporations and oligarchs through rigged financial systems, coercion, and violence, a Cold War-era strategy refined to secure resource extraction and political compliance for the American ruling class. During the Cold War, the US appointed itself the leader of a democratic camp against socialist states, using aid to sympathetic countries and populations to isolate them. Foreign aid spending peaked at 4.7% of the federal budget in 1963, but collapsed to 0.6% by 1989 when the Soviet Union was in decline, revealing USAID's overtly transactional purpose. If it really was about poverty alleviation or whatever other positive goals, the funding wouldn't follow the ebb and flow of American politics. Modern priorities make this even more clear. $14 billion in direct aid to Ukraine for the war against Russia, and $3.3 billion annually to Israel, not to mention the many other grants and funding, but not a cent to the American public. Monroe doctrine types say that dismantling USAID risks ceding regions like Africa and Latin America to rival powers, as if these areas were theirs to do with as they wish, eliminating decades of NGO-driven soft power. The language really is disgusting. The World Bank's Eugene Black explicitly stated that aid was meant to maintain the West's political and economic dynamic in the Global South, a stance mirrored in USAID's funneling of loans to privatized infrastructure projects in the modern day. Aid programs prioritize corporate profits over local welfare. Loans to nations like Ecuador are structured to enrich firms like Bechtel and Halliburton, indebting countries and forcing resource extraction. This promotion of democracy and free markets masks a more nefarious neoliberal project. Crises, real or imagined, are weaponized to enforce mass privatization, especially of state institutions. I made a video on privatization recently, which you can see here. This also bites at home. After Hurricane Katrina destroyed New Orleans, the city replaced 123 public schools with 31 charter schools, leading to the firing of 4,700 unionized teachers to benefit contractors, a template that's been replicated globally. The doctrine that only a crisis produces real change underpins the strategy. When economic coercion fails, military intervention, or the threat of it, typically ensures compliance. Ultimately, though, domestic politics drive aid fluctuations and...
He's a right-winger. Anytime Ragebait gets posted on Twitter calling for the execution of Black T for stealing a jacket, his videos have the sheen of quality, but they're almost always the video essays on other people's work. The reason he makes videos of why he isn't a Zionist is because he tweets dumb shit all the fucking time that would imply he is one. Oh no.
Always prioritize petty, partisan interests over general welfare. Not only that, but the public doesn't care about this topic. US public ambivalence towards aid should be sobering to anybody who looks at it. Only 18% of Americans prioritize promoting democracy abroad, which makes sense as most Americans are struggling and don't have a democracy at home to begin with.
As you can see, that vandal badly damaged the car and spray painted the words, "Mike is a cheater," all over the vehicle. Well, the veteran who owns the car told us